Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the line between documented fact and whispered legend becomes dangerously thin. I am your guide through these shadowed archives, and tonight we venture into the desolate plains of West Texas, to a place that time tried to erase. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you watching this alone in the darkness of your room? Perhaps it's late evening, and the world outside has grown quiet? Or maybe you're brave enough to listen during daylight hours, surrounded by the noise of everyday life. Tell me in the comments below where you are and what time it is as you hear this story. Your presence here, in this moment, connects you to something that happened over a century ago, something that refuses to stay buried. October 1881, the state of Texas, a time when the frontier was still raw, still dangerous, still filled with spaces on maps marked simply as uninhabited territory. The great cattle drives were beginning to slow. Railroads were creeping across the landscape like iron veins, and small communities clung to existence in the vast emptiness between established towns. These were places where a stranger's arrival was an event, where news traveled slowly, and where the night brought genuine fear to those who lived far from the protection of larger settlements. Nightfall Ridge was one such place. The name itself tells you something about the character of this settlement. It was not a town, not officially. It existed as a waypoint, a cluster of wooden structures built along a little-used trail connecting San Antonio to the western reaches of Texas. Perhaps 30 families called it home. A general store, a small church, a boarding house for travelers, and scattered homesteads stretching into the surrounding scrubland. The ridge itself was a low geological formation, unremarkable except for one quality. When the sun set, it created a shadow that fell across the settlement with unsettling speed, as if night itself was eager to claim this particular patch of earth. The people of Nightfall Ridge were hardy, practical folks, ranchers mostly, with a few merchants and craftsmen. They knew the dangers of their environment: rattlesnakes, droughts, the occasional conflict with displaced indigenous peoples, bandits moving along the lonely roads. They were not prone to superstition. They solved problems with rifles, rope, and hard work, which makes what happened in October of 1881 all the more disturbing. On the 15th of that month, as the afternoon sun began its rapid descent behind the ridge, a caravan appeared on the eastern approach to the settlement. Not the typical freight wagons or cattle drives the residents were accustomed to seeing. This was different. 3 covered wagons, dark canvas stretched over curved frames, pulled by horses that seemed too fine, too well kept for the rough country they had supposedly crossed. The caravan moved slowly, almost ceremonially, and as it drew closer, the residents who had gathered near the general store noticed something peculiar. The travelers made no sound. No calls to the horses, no conversation among themselves, no creaking of wheels that should have been audible across the flat terrain. Just silent, steady movement toward the settlement. Sheriff Thomas Brennan stood on the porch of his small office, watching the approach with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 2 decades on the frontier by trusting his instincts. Something about this caravan made his hand drift toward the revolver at his hip, something he could not yet name, but could certainly feel. The lead wagon came to a stop in front of the general store. A man stepped down from the driver's seat. Tall, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a black suit that seemed far too formal, too clean, for someone who should have been traveling through the dust and heat of the Texas plains. His hair was dark, swept back from a pale face, and when he smiled at the gathering crowd, his teeth seemed unnaturally white in the fading light. He introduced himself as Dr. Cornelius Vale, a traveling physician and purveyor of medicinal tonics. He explained in a voice that carried an accent no one could quite place, passing through on his way west, and would be grateful for the opportunity to rest his horses and perhaps offer his services to any in the community who might be suffering from ailments. Sheriff Brennan granted permission for the caravan to camp on the outskirts of the settlement. It seemed at the time like a simple act of frontier hospitality. By sunrise the next morning, that decision would reveal itself as something far more sinister. To understand what happened in Nightfall Ridge, we must first understand the Texas of 1881. This was a state still recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, which had ended only 16 years prior. The Reconstruction era had officially concluded in 1877, but its effects lingered like a fever that refuses to break. Communities throughout Texas existed in a strange liminal space, caught between the lawlessness of the frontier and the creeping advance of modern civilization. The great Comanche conflicts had largely subsided by this time, though tensions remained. The last major engagement, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, had occurred in 1874, and the remaining indigenous populations were being systematically relocated to reservations in Indian Territory. This created vast stretches of land that were technically safe for settlement, but psychologically still felt dangerous, still felt watched. Nightfall Ridge had been established in 1873 by a group of families seeking to claim land along what they hoped would become a major trade route. The ridge itself was a limestone formation, approximately 200 feet high and running for nearly 3 miles in an east-west direction. Geological surveys from the period describe it as unremarkable, but local accounts suggest something different. In a letter dated March 1874, housed in the Texas State Archives, a surveyor named Michael Garrett wrote to his supervisor, "The ridge casts a shadow of unusual density. The locals have begun calling it Nightfall Ridge, as the sun's setting creates a darkness that falls across the valley floor with unnatural speed. I do not share their superstitions, but I will admit the effect is disquieting." The settlement that grew in the shadow of this ridge was typical of the region. The 1880 census, conducted just 1 year before the events we're examining, recorded 32 families, comprising 147 individuals. The population was predominantly of European descent, with surnames suggesting English, German, and Irish origins. There were also 12 Mexican families, descendants of the original Tejano settlers who had inhabited the region long before the Anglo influx. The community centered around several key establishments. Heinrich Meller's General Store served as the commercial and social hub, a 2-story wooden structure where residents gathered to collect mail, purchase supplies, and exchange news. The store's ledger, preserved in fragmentary form at the West Texas Historical Museum, shows entries for standard frontier goods: flour, coffee, ammunition, rope, whiskey, lamp oil. Nothing unusual for the time and place. The church, a simple Methodist structure built in 1876, stood at the northern edge of the settlement. Reverend Samuel Blackwood, a former Union chaplain, led services there every Sunday. His sermon notes, discovered in a trunk in 1952 by his great-grandson, reveal a man concerned with the spiritual welfare of his isolated flock, frequently preaching about the dangers of isolation leading to moral degradation and the importance of maintaining civilized values even at the edge of the known world. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, whom we met in our introduction, was a man of considerable experience. Born in Missouri in 1829, he had fought in the Mexican-American War as a young man, served as a Texas Ranger in the 1850s, and spent the Civil War years protecting frontier settlements from opportunistic raiders. By 1881, he was nearing the end of his career, his hair gone gray, his body bearing the scars of multiple gunshot wounds and knife fights. But his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to protecting the community under his authority was absolute. A photograph of Brennan, taken in 1880, shows a lean man with hard eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual line of grim determination. Among the prominent families of Nightfall Ridge, the Cole family held particular importance. Jeremiah Cole had arrived in 1874 with his wife Margaret and their infant daughter Sarah. He established a successful cattle operation, gradually expanding his holdings until he controlled nearly 3,000 acres of grazing land. By 1881, the Coles were arguably the wealthiest family in the settlement. Their daughter Sarah, now 14 years old, was described in contemporary accounts as intelligent and curious, often seen reading books ordered from San Antonio, unusual for a ranch girl of that era. The boarding house was operated by a widow named Elizabeth Chen, whose unusual surname came from her marriage to a Chinese railroad worker who had died in a construction accident in 1877. She maintained rooms for travelers and served meals to anyone who could pay. Her establishment would become central to the events of October 1881, as it was here that Dr. Vale and his companion would take their lodgings. The settlement existed in relative stability until the autumn of 1881. The summer had been harsh, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and drought conditions affecting the water supply. Several wells had run dry, forcing families to travel greater distances to the Nightfall Creek, a seasonal waterway that ran along the base of the ridge. The stress of these conditions had created a palpable tension in the community, but nothing that preparation and hard work could not address. Or so they believed. In the weeks before the caravan's arrival, several residents reported unusual occurrences. Livestock deaths that could not be attributed to disease or predation. Cattle found in the morning, drained of blood, with no apparent wounds, save for 2 small punctures on the neck. Coyotes, the ever-present scavengers of the Texas wilderness, refused to approach these carcasses. Ranchers burned the bodies and tried to forget what they had seen. Then came the dreams. Multiple residents, including Sheriff Brennan's deputy, a young man named Marcus Webb, reported nightmares of figures standing at the foot of their beds, watching in silence. These reports were dismissed as heat-induced delirium, a consequence of the oppressive summer and the psychological strain of frontier life. A journal entry from Margaret Cole, dated October 10th, 1881, 5 days before the caravan's arrival, reads, "Sarah has been acting strangely of late. She claims to hear singing in the distance at night, though Jeremiah and I hear nothing. She stands at her window, staring toward the ridge, and will not explain what she sees. I have considered asking Reverend Blackwood to pray with her, but I fear making too much of what is likely the imaginings of an adolescent mind. Still, I cannot shake the feeling that something has changed in the air around our home. The horses are restless. The dogs will not stop barking after sunset." 5 days later, the caravan arrived, and nothing in Nightfall Ridge would ever be the same. The caravan established its camp approximately half a mile south of the main settlement, in a clearing near Nightfall Creek. Dr. Cornelius Vale personally selected the location, walking the perimeter with careful attention before declaring it suitable. Several residents who observed this noted that he seemed to be measuring distances, counting paces, as if following some predetermined plan that existed only in his mind. The 3 wagons formed a triangular arrangement, their openings facing inward, creating a private courtyard invisible from the outside. Canvas sheets were stretched between the wagons, further obscuring the interior from curious eyes. Sheriff Brennan, making his official inspection of the camp that first evening, found this arrangement unusual, but not necessarily suspicious. Travelers often valued their privacy, especially when carrying valuable goods. Dr. Vale introduced his traveling companion, a young woman he identified as Miriam Crowley, his assistant and ward. She appeared to be approximately 19 years old, though something about her bearing suggested either greater youth or far greater age, depending on the angle of observation. She had pale skin, darker than was fashionable for the era, and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She spoke little during the sheriff's visit, but when she did, her voice carried the same unplaceable accent as her guardian's. That first night passed quietly, or so it seemed at the time. It was only later, when residents compared their experiences, that a disturbing pattern emerged. At least 7 families reported that their dogs had barked continuously from sunset until well past midnight. Horses in the stable behind Müller's general store had kicked at their stalls with such violence that Heinrich Müller himself went to check on them, finding them in a state of terror he had never witnessed in 20 years of handling livestock. Most strangely, several people reported waking in the darkest hours before dawn with the sensation of being watched, only to find their windows open, despite having secured them before sleeping. Elizabeth Chen, the boarding house proprietor, would later testify that she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. When she opened her door to investigate, the hallway was empty, but the front door of the establishment stood ajar, allowing the cold night air to flow through the building. The first tangible incident occurred on the morning of October 16th. A ranch hand named Thomas Whitmore, employed by Jeremiah Cole, failed to report for work. This was unusual, as Whitmore was known for his reliability. Cole sent 2 men to check on Whitmore's small cabin, located about a mile from the main ranch house. They found him lying in his bed, alive but in a state that defied easy explanation. Whitmore was conscious but could barely speak. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he seemed to have lost considerable weight overnight. Most disturbing were the 2 small wounds on his neck, approximately an inch apart, which had bled, but were now clotted with a dark, almost black substance. When questioned about what had happened, Whitmore could only whisper fragments. "She was beautiful. She asked to come in. I couldn't refuse. I'm so cold." "Why's everything so cold?" Dr. Vale, hearing of the illness, offered his services. Sheriff Brennan, hoping that a physician might provide answers, granted permission for the visit. Vale examined Whitmore for nearly an hour, while Jeremiah Cole and several ranch hands waited outside the cabin. When he emerged, his expression was grave. According to Cole's later testimony, preserved in a deposition taken in 1883, Vale diagnosed Whitmore with a severe blood disorder, possibly brought on by exposure to contaminated water or the bite of some venomous creature. He administered a tonic from his medical bag, assuring Cole that Whitmore would recover with rest and fluids. He also suggested that the wounds on Whitmore's neck were likely the bite of a particularly large spider, or possibly a bat. This explanation satisfied Cole at the time. It would not satisfy him for long. Over the next 3 days, 4 more cases of the same mysterious illness appeared. In Nightfall Ridge, a woman named Catherine Perry, wife of the blacksmith, a teenage boy, Daniel Mueller, son of the general store owner, an elderly man, Jacob Reeves, who lived alone in a small house at the eastern edge of the settlement, and most troublingly, Margaret Cole herself, Jeremiah's wife. Each case followed an identical pattern. The victim would be found in the morning, weakened, pale, with the same 2 small wounds on the neck. Each reported similar fragmentary memories. A visitor. In the night, a voice asking permission to enter, an overwhelming compulsion to comply, and then a growing coldness that seemed to spread from the wound sites through their entire body. Dr. Vale attended to each patient, administering his tonics and offering reassurances. But the patients did not improve. They grew steadily weaker, refusing food, barely able to rise from their beds. Their skin took on a translucent quality, veins visible beneath the surface like dark rivers on a pale map. Reverend Blackwood visited the sick, offering prayer and spiritual comfort. After seeing Catherine Perry, he pulled Sheriff Brennan aside and spoke words that would be recorded in Brennan's personal journal. "Thomas, I have seen death many times. I saw it on the battlefields of the war, in field hospitals where men died by the hundreds from disease and infection. What I saw in Catherine Perry's eyes was not the approach of natural death. It was something else, something that should not exist in God's creation. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe this was a natural disease, perhaps something brought by the travelers, or was something else, something darker, preying on the residents of Nightfall Ridge? Share your theories, and remember the people who experienced this believed it was real enough to die from it." On the evening of October 19th, 4 days after the caravan's arrival, Sarah Cole disappeared. She had been restless all day, according to her father's testimony. Despite her mother's worsening condition, Sarah seemed distracted, almost entranced. She spent hours staring out the window toward the caravan camp, humming a melody that no one recognized. When questioned about the song, she claimed not to remember humming at all. After sunset, Jeremiah Cole checked on his daughter in her room. Her bed was empty. The window stood open, her nightgown was draped across the chair, and she had dressed herself in her finest Sunday clothes, as if preparing for some important occasion. Jeremiah immediately rode to Sheriff Brennan's office, arriving in a state of panic that was unprecedented for the normally stoic rancher. Brennan assembled a search party within minutes. 8 armed men, carrying torches and lanterns, fanned out across the settlement and surrounding area. They found Sarah's trail quickly. Her footprints in the soft earth led directly toward the caravan camp. When the search party reached the clearing by Nightfall Creek, they found the camp abandoned, not merely empty, but stripped with the thoroughness of a military evacuation. The wagons were gone. No trace of fire pits or refuse remained. Even the areas where the wagon wheels should have left deep impressions in the ground showed no marks whatsoever. It was as if the caravan had never existed at all. In the center of where the camp had been, they found a single item: Sarah Cole's ribbon, the blue one she wore in her hair every Sunday to church. It lay on the ground, perfectly centered in the clearing, as if placed there deliberately, and nearby, almost invisible in the darkness until Marcus Webb's lantern passed over it, they discovered something far more disturbing: a journal bound in leather that seemed too old, too worn to have been part of anyone's recent possessions. The pages inside were covered in handwriting that shifted between English, what appeared to be German or possibly Dutch, and symbols that none of them recognized. Sheriff Brennan took possession of the journal. He would spend the next 3 days attempting to decipher its contents, growing more disturbed with each page he managed to translate. What he found would force him to confront possibilities that his rational, frontier-hardened mind had always dismissed as superstition and nonsense. But before we examine what the journal contained, we must acknowledge what happened in Nightfall Ridge during Sarah Cole's absence. Because the disappearances had only just begun. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was not an educated man in the formal sense, but 2 decades on the frontier had taught him to read situations, to interpret signs that others might miss, and to trust evidence over assumption. The journal he had recovered from the abandoned caravan camp challenged every rational principle he had lived by. The first entries were in English, dated from the early 1840s, written in a careful, precise hand. They described a physician's practice in New Orleans, treating victims of yellow fever during an outbreak. The author, who signed himself as C. Vale, documented his growing frustration with the limitations of contemporary medicine, his inability to save patients despite his knowledge and training. The tone was professional, clinical, the observations of a man dedicated to healing. Then the entries changed. In March of 1847, Vale wrote about meeting a patient unlike any he had encountered before. An elderly woman, brought to his clinic by neighbors who claimed she had not aged in the 30 years they had known her. She was dying, finally, from what Vale diagnosed as consumption. But before her death, she spoke to him at length about the nature of her longevity, about a condition that existed outside the boundaries of medical science. The entry from March 23, 1847, marked the transformation of the journal from medical record to something far darker. She offered me a choice: to continue my futile struggle against death, losing patient after patient to forces I cannot control, or to embrace a different path. She claimed to be 147 years old. I did not believe her. Then she showed me documents, letters written in her own hand, dated from 1702, from 1745, from 1789, the handwriting identical, the signature unchanged. She asked if I wished to continue healing for a lifetime, or to exist beyond the constraints of mortality itself. God forgive me. I said yes. The following pages detailed Vale's transformation. He described it in medical terms, as if observing his own body as a clinical specimen. The heightened senses, the growing sensitivity to sunlight, the changing relationship with food, with sustenance, and most disturbingly, what he called the hunger. Brennan, reading by lamplight in his office, felt his hands begin to shake as he turned the pages. The journal described how Vale had learned to control his condition, to feed sparingly, to move from place to place before suspicion could accumulate. He had developed a system: travel in a caravan, present himself as a physician, gain the trust of isolated communities, and feed on those who would not be immediately missed. Ranch hands, drifters, elderly individuals living alone. But the journal also revealed Vale's growing dissatisfaction with this existence. An entry from 1863 read, "I have lived as a monster for 16 years. I have taken blood from perhaps 200 souls, always careful, always measured, never enough to kill. I convinced myself this was sustainable, that I was still serving a purpose by providing medical care even as I took nourishment. But the truth is inescapable. I am a predator. The medicine is merely camouflage." Then came mentions of Miriam. Vale had encountered her in 1879, already transformed, already hunting. She had been turned against her will by someone he referred to only as the Father, a figure who appeared throughout the later journal entries but was never fully described. Miriam had no control, no discipline. She killed frequently, messily, leaving trails of bodies that attracted attention and put others of their kind at risk. Vale had taken her as his ward, teaching her restraint, teaching her the methods that would allow them to exist without constant pursuit. The caravan had been established as their mobile hunting ground, moving through the sparse settlements of the frontier where record-keeping was poor and law enforcement was scattered. The final entries that Brennan could decipher were dated October 1881, written in the days before the caravan arrived at Nightfall Ridge. Vale described feeling watched, sensing that something was tracking them. He wrote of dreams in which the Father appeared, commanding him to abandon his careful methods and to feed without restraint. He wrote of Miriam growing increasingly difficult to control, her hunger overwhelming the discipline he had tried to instill. The last legible entry, dated October 14, 1881, one day before their arrival, contained a single sentence that made Sheriff Brennan's blood run cold. "We should not stop at Nightfall Ridge. I know this, and yet I cannot resist. Something calls us there, something older than even the Father, something waiting beneath the ridge itself." While Brennan studied the journal, the situation in Nightfall Ridge deteriorated rapidly. On the morning of October 20th, Thomas Whitmore was found dead in his cabin. His body had been drained of blood so completely that his skin appeared translucent, like parchment stretched over bone. The 2 wounds on his neck had expanded, becoming ragged tears, as if something had fed with increasing desperation. Catherine Perry died the same day, then Jacob Reeves that evening. Daniel Mueller, the teenager, clung to life but was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his pulse nearly undetectable. Margaret Cole, Jeremiah's wife, showed a different pattern. Unlike the others, she was not weakening. Instead, she was changing. Her skin, while pale, had taken on a luminous quality. Her eyes, once brown, now appeared darker, almost black in certain light. She refused all food, but asked repeatedly for water, which she would drink and then vomit within minutes. Most disturbing was her behavior at night. Ranch hands posted to watch the Cole house reported seeing her standing at the window for hours, motionless, staring toward the ridge. When Jeremiah tried to comfort her, she recoiled from his touch, claiming his body heat was painful to her skin. Reverend Blackwood attempted an intervention, bringing holy water and his Bible to perform what he called spiritual cleansing. Margaret's reaction was immediate and violent. She screamed at the sight of the Bible, covering her eyes and backing into the corner of the room. When Blackwood sprinkled holy water in her direction, she collapsed, clutching at her skin as if it burned. "It's not supposed to be real," Blackwood said later that evening, his voice shaking as he spoke. With Sheriff Brennan, the stories about holy water, about the cross, about creatures of the night, their folklore, superstition, meant to comfort simple minds. They're not supposed to work. But Thomas, I saw her reaction. I saw her burn. Brennan showed him the journal. The Reverend read it in silence, his face growing progressively more drawn, more aged, as he absorbed the implications of Vale's confessions. When he finished, he closed the book carefully and sat for several minutes without speaking. "We are not equipped for this," he finally said. "Not spiritually, not practically. This is beyond the scope of law enforcement, beyond the reach of medicine, perhaps even beyond the power of prayer." "Then what do we do?" Brennan asked. "We find the girl. We find Sarah Cole. Because if Vale's writings are accurate, if she has been taken by these creatures, then she is either already dead or she is transforming into one of them. And if she returns to Nightfall Ridge, if she comes back, changed, then God help us all." The search for Sarah and the vanished caravan expanded. Brennan sent riders to every settlement within a 3-day journey, carrying descriptions and warnings. Telegraph messages were dispatched to San Antonio, to El Paso, to Austin, requesting any information about traveling physicians matching Vale's description. The responses that came back were fragmentary, but deeply troubling. A sheriff in Eagle Pass reported a similar incident 3 years prior. A traveling doctor, a young woman assistant, unexplained deaths. The caravan had departed before any formal investigation could begin. A ranger in Fort Stockton described an encounter in 1877. Deaths matching the pattern, victims drained of blood. A mysterious caravan that disappeared overnight. Reports stretched back to 1865, scattered across Texas and into New Mexico territory. Always the same pattern, always the same escape. No one had ever captured Vale or his companion. No one had ever definitively proven what they were until Nightfall Ridge. On October 22nd, a week after the caravan's arrival, a local boy named Timothy Nash made a discovery while hunting rabbits near the base of Nightfall Ridge. He found an opening in the limestone formation, partially concealed by scrub brush and fallen rock. The opening was not natural. Someone had excavated it recently, judging by the freshness of the tool marks visible on the stone. Timothy ran to tell his father, who in turn informed Sheriff Brennan. By mid-afternoon, Brennan had assembled a group of men to investigate. They brought lanterns, rope, and weapons, though none of them were certain what they might face in the darkness below the ridge. The opening led to a narrow passage that descended at a steep angle into the earth. The air that flowed from the tunnel was cold, far colder than it should have been given the October heat still lingering above ground. It carried a smell that several men later described as ancient, like opening a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Sheriff Brennan went first, holding his lantern ahead and moving carefully down the rough-hewn passage. Behind him came Jeremiah Cole, Reverend Blackwood, Heinrich Müller, and 4 other men, all armed, all terrified but determined to find answers. The passage opened into a chamber approximately 30 feet below the surface. The lantern light revealed a space that defied natural explanation. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered with symbols that matched some of those Brennan had seen in Vale's journal. But these were older, carved deep into the stone, filled with a dark substance that might have been dried blood, or might have been something else entirely. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, or what had once been an altar. It was broken now, split down the middle as if struck by tremendous force. Around it lay the remnants of what might have been offerings, fragments of pottery, pieces of jewelry, bones that were definitely not animal. And in alcoves carved into the walls, they found the dead, not recent dead. These were old, mummified by the dry air of the chamber, preserved in various states of decay. Men, women, children, dozens of them, perhaps more, extending back into passages that branched off from the main chamber, passages that the group did not have the courage to explore that day. Each body bore the same marks, 2 small punctures on the neck, now dried and sunken but unmistakable. Reverend Blackwood knelt before one of the alcoves, examining a body that wore the remnants of clothing from perhaps 50 years prior, judging by the style and fabric. He found a locket around the corpse's neck, and inside a miniature portrait of a young woman and a lock of hair. "This is Mary Whitfield," Blackwood said quietly. "I've seen this portrait before. She was the wife of one of the original settlers in this region, back in the 1830s. She disappeared in 1834. They assumed she had been taken by Comanches or had died in the wilderness. They never found her body." "How many are here?" Muller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Brennan moved his lantern slowly across the chamber, counting alcoves. "At least 40 visible from here. Maybe more in the passages beyond." The implication was inescapable. Whatever Vale and Miriam were, whatever had transformed them into predators, they were not the first to hunt in this region. The chamber beneath Nightfall Ridge had been a feeding ground for decades, possibly longer. The ridge itself had been named for the speed of the shadow it cast, but perhaps that naming contained a deeper truth. Perhaps night fell quickly here because something beneath the earth was calling it down, creating darkness in which to hunt. They found evidence of recent activity. Fresh candles, burned down but not yet fully consumed. A wooden box containing glass vials filled with preserved blood. And in the deepest alcove, recently occupied and recently vacated, they found Sarah Cole's Sunday shoes, placed carefully side by side, as if she had stepped out of them voluntarily and walked deeper into the darkness barefoot. Jeremiah Cole let out a sound that was not quite human, a mixture of rage and grief and despair. He grabbed one of the lanterns and started toward the passage from which they had discovered Sarah's shoes. Brennan caught his arm. "Jeremiah, no, we don't know what's down there. We don't know if she's my daughter," Cole shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber, disturbing something in the darkness that made a sound like wings, like breath, like whispered prayers in a language none of them knew. Before Brennan could respond, the lanterns began to flicker, all of them simultaneously, as if responding to a draft that had not been present moments before. And from the deep passage, the one from which Sarah's shoes had been found, came a voice. Young, female, familiar. "Papa, is that you, Papa? I'm so cold down here. Won't you come help me? Won't you come bring me home?" It was Sarah's voice, but underneath it, layered like a second speaker barely audible, was something else, something that had learned to mimic a daughter's plea, but could not quite hide its true nature. Jeremiah Cole started forward. Sheriff Brennan drew his revolver and fired a single shot into the ceiling of the chamber. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and when the echoes finally died away, so did Sarah's voice, or whatever had been using her voice. "We're leaving," Brennan said quietly. "Now, all of us. We seal this chamber, we post guards, and we do not return until we have a plan." The men retreated up the passage, some of them nearly running in their desperation to escape the darkness below. As they emerged into the fading afternoon light, several of them fell to their knees, gasping for air, grateful to be out of that place. But they all understood the terrible truth they had uncovered. Nightfall Ridge was not named for a geographical quirk. It was named for what lived beneath it. And whatever had called Dr. Cornelius Vale and Miriam Crowley to this place, it was still down there, waiting in the darkness, speaking with the voices of the dead. The immediate aftermath of the discovery beneath Nightfall Ridge is documented in fragmentary and often contradictory sources. What we can piece together suggests a community traumatized beyond its capacity to process what it had encountered. Sheriff Brennan ordered the entrance to the chamber sealed with dynamite. On October 24, 1881, explosives were placed in the passage and the opening was collapsed. The official report, filed with the county records, stated simply that a dangerous cave system had been discovered and sealed for public safety. No mention was made of what had been found inside, but the sealing of the chamber did not end the events in Nightfall Ridge. Margaret Cole died on October 26th, 2 days after the chamber was sealed. Or perhaps died is not the correct word. Her body ceased to function in the way that living bodies do. She stopped breathing, her heart stopped beating, and yet when Jeremiah approached her bed to confirm her death, her eyes opened. She looked at him with recognition, with what might have been love or might have been hunger, and whispered a single word: "Sundown." Then she truly died, her body collapsing into rapid decomposition, aging decades in moments, until nothing remained but dust and bone. Reverend Blackwood performed a burial service, but refused to inter her body in the church cemetery. She was buried instead on the Cole Ranch, in an unmarked grave, at a crossroads, with a stake driven through the location where her heart had been. Blackwood would never fully explain this decision, but those who attended the burial understood the implication. Sarah Cole was never found. Not alive, not dead, not transformed. She simply vanished from the historical record after that October evening when her voice, or something wearing her voice, called to her father from the darkness beneath the ridge. Jeremiah Cole lived for another 11 years, dying in 1892 from what was officially recorded as a riding accident. But a letter discovered in 1967, written by Cole's ranch foreman to a friend in San Antonio, tells a different story. The letter, dated November 1892, states, "The boss rode out to the ridge last night, same as he's done every night. Known for 11 years. This time he didn't come back. We found his horse at sunup, but no sign of Mr. Cole. The ground near where they sealed that cave was disturbed, like something had been digging from below. We didn't look closer. We didn't want to know." The settlement of Nightfall Ridge began to decline almost immediately after the events of 1881. Families left, citing drought, economic hardship, the desire to be closer to larger towns. By 1890, the population had dropped to fewer than 50 individuals. By 1900, the settlement was effectively abandoned. The last census entry for Nightfall Ridge was recorded in 1910, listing a population of 7, all elderly individuals who had nowhere else to go. The ridge itself remained, of course. Geography does not forget, even when people try to. In 1952, a geology professor from the University of Texas named Dr. Raymond Fisher led a student expedition to study the limestone formations in West Texas. Among their survey sites was the ridge, formerly known as Nightfall Ridge, though by that time local maps had begun referring to it simply as Shadow Ridge or Dark Ridge, the original name apparently too disturbing for modern sensibilities. Dr. Fisher's field notes, preserved in the university archives, describe finding evidence of the sealed chamber. Erosion and natural settling had partially reopened the entrance, creating a gap large enough for a man to squeeze through. Against his better judgment, Fisher descended into the darkness with 2 graduate students. They found the chamber much as Sheriff Brennan had left it 71 years earlier, though time and moisture had taken their toll. The mummified bodies had largely collapsed into skeletal remains. The symbols on the walls were still visible, and Fisher photographed them extensively, though he never published his findings. What troubled Fisher most, according to a letter he wrote to a colleague, was not what they found, but what they didn't find. The passages leading deeper into the earth, the ones Sheriff Brennan had been too wise or too frightened to explore, were empty. The alcoves that should have contained bodies were vacant. Fresh scratches on the stone floor suggested something had been dragged through the passages recently, though Fisher couldn't determine how recently. Days, years. The dry air made such determinations impossible. And in one of the alcoves they found something that should not have existed. A Polaroid photograph. The technology for which had only been introduced in 1948, just 4 years before Fisher's expedition. The photograph showed a young woman in modern dress, standing in what appeared to be the main chamber, smiling at the camera. On the back, written in neat cursive, Sarah, 1950. Fisher took the photograph along with samples of the symbols and left the chamber. He never returned. When questioned years later by a documentary filmmaker in 1979, Fisher refused to discuss what he had found, saying only, "Some things should remain buried, not because they are dangerous to know, but because knowing them changes you in ways you cannot reverse." In 1963, a rancher named William Hayes purchased the land that included the Ridge Formation. He was unaware of its history, the county records having been damaged in a courthouse fire in 1934 that conveniently destroyed many documents from the 1880s. Hayes planned to graze cattle on the land and had no interest in local folklore or legends. His cattle refused to approach the ridge. All of them, without exception, would graze up to a certain invisible boundary and then retreat, no matter how green the grass appeared beyond that line. Hayes found this peculiar but economically tolerable. He had plenty of grazing land elsewhere. In the winter of 1964, Hayes's teenage son, Marcus, went missing while riding fence lines near the ridge. A search party found his horse the next day, but Marcus was gone. 3 days later, he reappeared, walking out of the scrubland near the sealed chamber entrance, dehydrated and confused. He claimed to have no memory of where he had been, but suffered from severe photosensitivity for the rest of his life and developed an unusual aversion to mirrors. A psychologist who examined Marcus in 1975 as part of a study on trauma-related amnesia noted in her case file, "Patient displays all the symptoms of someone who has experienced profound psychological trauma but cannot or will not identify the source." He mentions recurring dreams of being underground, of voices speaking in languages he doesn't understand, of a young woman who hasn't aged since the 1880s, asking him to deliver a message to her father. When I asked what the message was, he became agitated and refused to continue the session. Marcus Hayes died in 1981, exactly 100 years after the original events at Nightfall Ridge. His death was ruled a suicide, though family members disputed this, claiming he had been in good spirits and had no history of depression. He was found in his truck, parked at the base of the ridge, with a single gunshot wound to the head. The medical examiner noted an unusual detail in the autopsy report. Marcus's blood volume was approximately 30% below normal, though there was no evidence of significant blood loss at the scene. The most recent documented incident occurred in 1987. A group of urban explorers from Austin, having heard legends about the vampire caves of West Texas, located the sealed chamber and forced their way inside with modern equipment. 4 young people entered. 3 emerged 6 hours later, refusing to speak about what they had seen. The 4th, a woman named Jessica Crane, was never found. The 3 who escaped were interviewed separately by local law enforcement. Their stories were consistent to an unsettling degree. They described finding the chamber filled with recent evidence of occupation: sleeping bags, camping equipment, food supplies. They found journals written in modern English, describing techniques for managing the hunger and avoiding detection in the modern era. They found photographs spanning decades, showing the same individuals at different historical moments, standing in front of a Model T Ford in the 1920s, attending a sock hop in the 1950s, protesting the Vietnam War in the 1960s, and they claimed to have encountered someone in the deepest passage. A young woman, appearing to be approximately 19 years old, wearing a dress from the Victorian era, speaking with perfect modern English accent, but occasionally slipping into older speech patterns. She told them her name was Miriam. She asked if they had seen her guardian, a Dr. Vale, who she said had been gone for a very long time and whose absence troubled her greatly. When they asked about Jessica Crane, their missing companion, Miriam smiled and said, "She chose to stay." Some people, when offered the choice between a brief, bright life and a long, dark one, make surprising decisions. Don't worry, she won't be lonely. There are others here who have made the same choice over the years. The 3 explorers ran. They sealed the entrance behind them as best they could and swore never to return. Local authorities investigated but found no evidence of Jessica Crane, alive or dead. The case remains officially unsolved. The land was purchased by the state of Texas in 1992 and designated as protected wilderness, though the official reason given was geological instability. Access to the ridge is now restricted, though this has not prevented occasional trespassers drawn by the legends that persist in local folklore. And the legends do persist. Stories of a caravan that still travels the back roads of West Texas, appearing briefly in small towns before vanishing. Reports of mysterious illnesses that drain victims of blood and vitality. Whispered tales of people who disappeared in the 1880s still being seen, unchanged, timeless, hunting. In the darkness, are these stories true? Are they the elaborations of imagination, building mythology around tragic but mundane events? Or is there something still beneath Nightfall Ridge, something that predates human settlement in this region, something that will outlast all of us? The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, impossible to verify with certainty. But the ridge still stands. And when the sun sets behind it, the shadow still falls across the land with unusual speed, bringing darkness just a little too quickly, as if something below is calling the night down to cover its activities. Some ranchers in the area still refuse to let their cattle near the ridge. Some parents still warn their children not to explore the old limestone formations. Some travelers on the back roads still report seeing lights near the base of the ridge at night, and the silhouette of covered wagons that vanish when approached. History has a way of forgetting what it cannot explain, but the land remembers, and what sleeps beneath the ridge may not sleep forever. So what happened in Nightfall Ridge in October of 1881? What was the true nature of Dr. Cornelius Vale and Miriam Crowley, and what still lies beneath that limestone ridge in the West Texas wilderness? The rational mind seeks simple explanations. Perhaps this was merely a case of serial killers, predators who use the guise of medical practice to access vulnerable victims. The journal could have been a fabrication designed to create supernatural fear and misdirection. The chamber beneath the ridge might have been a burial site used by indigenous peoples long before European settlement, its dark purpose misinterpreted by frightened settlers. The deaths could be attributed to disease, possibly a blood disorder or infection that 19th century medicine could not properly diagnose or treat. This explanation is comfortable. It allows us to file these events away as historical tragedy, terrible but comprehensible, within the boundaries of human evil and medical ignorance. Many historians have adopted this interpretation, noting that the 1880s were rife with traveling con artists, and that isolated frontier communities were particularly vulnerable to manipulation by charismatic strangers. But this explanation fails to account for certain details. The Polaroid photograph found in 1952 showing someone identified as Sarah in a chamber sealed in 1881. The consistent reports spanning more than a century of the same individuals appearing unchanged. The physical evidence that defied medical explanation, bodies drained of blood with no apparent mechanism, victims who displayed symptoms that matched no known disease, the rapid decomposition of Margaret Cole's corpse. A second theory, advanced by paranormal researchers and those willing to entertain possibilities beyond conventional science, suggests that Vale and Miriam were indeed what folklore would call vampires, though that word carries so much cultural baggage that it obscures more than it illuminates. According to this interpretation, they were humans transformed by some biological or supernatural process into predators who sustained themselves on human blood. The chamber beneath the ridge was not their creation, but rather a far older site, perhaps a feeding ground used by others of their kind for centuries, possibly the very place where the transformation occurred. This theory accounts for the physical evidence and the consistency of reports across time. It explains why Dr. Fisher's photographs matched symbols found in European grimoires dealing with blood rituals. It provides context for why the land itself seems to resist normal use, why animals avoid the area, why darkness falls so quickly there. But it requires accepting that the world contains forces and entities that mainstream science has not acknowledged or cannot explain. It requires believing that predators walk among us, wearing human faces, living human lives sustained by a hunger that we have relegated to fiction and folklore. There is a third possibility, one that some researchers find most disturbing of all. What if the chamber beneath Nightfall Ridge is not a hunting ground, but a prison? What if something far older than Vale or Miriam resides in those deep passages, something that calls to those who carry the transformation, drawing them to that particular location? Vale's journal mentioned feeling summoned, unable to resist approaching the ridge despite knowing it was dangerous. Miriam, according to the urban explorer's testimony, spoke of waiting for Vale, suggesting she could not or would not leave. Perhaps the ridge is a place where whatever power creates these predators concentrates itself, a focal point, a doorway, and those who are transformed are drawn there, eventually, inevitably, to serve some purpose we cannot begin to comprehend. This theory explains the persistence of activity across more than a century. It explains why the site continues to exert influence despite being sealed, despite being restricted, despite all efforts to contain or destroy whatever resides there. If the power exists in the location itself, in the geological formation, or in something buried deeper than human excavation has reached, then sealing passages or restricting access accomplishes nothing meaningful. Which theory is correct? We cannot say with certainty. The evidence is real. The deaths were real. The terror experienced by the residents of Nightfall Ridge was undeniably real, but the explanation remains elusive, dancing just beyond the reach of rational inquiry. What we know is this: The ridge still stands. The chamber has been sealed and reopened multiple times. People still disappear in that region. Reports still surface of travelers who match the descriptions of individuals who should be long dead. And on certain nights when the wind blows from the west and the moon is dark, some claim to hear singing, drifting across the empty plains, a melody in a language no living person recognizes. Sarah Cole's fate remains unknown. Her father searched until his death, and some say his ghost still searches, riding the perimeter of the ridge on endless patrol, a father's love refusing to accept what logic suggests must be true. The caravan, according to legend, still travels. Different wagons perhaps, different covers, but the same purpose, the same hunger, the same two figures leading the way into isolated communities where questions are rarely asked and disappearances can be attributed to the harshness of the land. To this day, no one knows the truth of what happened in Nightfall Ridge. No one can prove definitively what Dr. Cornelius Vale and Miriam Crowley were or what became of them. No one can explain with absolute certainty what sleeps beneath that limestone formation, but the evidence suggests that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, and some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied. The ridge remembers, the land remembers, and perhaps, in the deepest darkness, something still waits. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's most disturbing forgotten chapters. If this story has affected you, if it has made you question what might exist in the shadows beyond our understanding, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you heard similar stories from your region? Do you believe in the possibility of predators that exist outside natural law? What theory do you find most compelling? Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring these haunted corners of history with me. Ring the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another forgotten terror. And welcome to our community of those brave enough to stare into the darkness and ask what stares back. Until we meet again in the shadows, remember, some stories are forgotten for a reason, but forgetting does not make them untrue. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but perhaps when night falls quickly and the shadows grow long, stay indoors.